Hello, history enthusiasts. Imagine standing in the middle of a timeline that stretches over 3 centuries, where every stitch of a soldier's uniform bears witness to the battles that shaped France, from the majestic presence of the Royal Guard to the proud blue of Napoleon's army, and all the way to the high-tech armor of 21st century troops. In today's video, we'll explore that extraordinary journey when each military uniform not only protected the body, but also told a story of power revolution and the relentless evolution of a European military powerhouse. Get ready for a thrilling, vivid voyage through every thread of France's military uniform history. The story of France's military dress begins in the age of absolute monarchs, when Europe's armies were still patchwork hosts of hired swords and local militias. In the early 1600s, a French soldier might march under the banner of a noble family one year, and a foreign prince the next, wearing whatever garments he could afford or loot. Commanders worried less about matching coats than about simply keeping their men fed and paid. Yet as the century wore on, the Bourbon crown hungered for more than temporary levies. It wanted a professional force that answered only to the king. The slow centralization of power under Louis XIII and his brilliant minister Cardinal Richelieu set the stage. But it was the Sun King Louis XIV who forged the decisive link between army and monarchy. By the 1660s, he was determined to turn France into the unrivaled military power of Europe. He poured treasure into barracks, training grounds, and weapons, but he also understood the power of appearance. An army clothed alike would not merely fight better. It would project the splendor of the crown itself. In 1671, Louis issued a royal ordinance that made history. For the first time, the French soldier would wear a standardized uniform, a visual oath of loyalty to the throne. Gone were the chaotic hues of mercenaries. The new pattern building on experiments under Louis XIII called for a gray-white coat lined with colored facings to mark regiments and ranks. Soldiers wore either a black tricorn or the slightly more rakish bicorn hat, its sharp silhouette instantly recognizable on parade grounds from Paris to Marseille. This was more than fashion. Uniforms simplified supply lines, allowed officers to spot deserters, and created a psychological bond among men who might speak different dialects and hail from distant provinces. When a peasant from Gascony stood shoulder to shoulder with a fisherman from Brittany, the cut of their coats told them they were brothers in arms of the king. These early coats were heavy wool, a practical shield against Europe's damp winters, but a torment in the summer sun. Buttons gleamed with brass polish, and belts of thick leather carried powder flasks, swords, or the prized flintlock musket. The musket itself was evolving. French gunsmiths improved the flint mechanism until the fusil light enough for quick volleys, yet deadly accurate for its time, became the weapon of choice. Troops armed with it earned the name Fusiliers, a title that outlived the weapon by generations. The shift to a standing uniformed army changed more than battlefield tactics. It altered the rhythm of village life. Sons who might once have joined seasonal militias now signed years-long contracts, returning home as seasoned veterans or not at all. Markets in garrison towns boomed as tailors and cobblers found steady work outfitting regiments. Drummers and fifers drilled in public squares, filling the air with martial music that reminded every onlooker of the king's reach. By the early 18th century, France's soldiers were a common sight across Europe and the colonies. When they set sail for distant frontiers, from the Caribbean to the St. Lawrence River, their gray-white coats carried the prestige of Versailles into forests and fortresses half a world away. Yet these elegant uniforms faced hard realities. Mud, rain, and smoke dulled their brilliance. Officers fretted over fading dyes and worn seams. Quartermasters struggled to ship enough cloth across oceans, and colonial troops sometimes patched their coats with whatever material they could find, blending old-world discipline with new-world improvisation. Still, the idea of the soldier as a walking emblem of royal authority held firm. To wear the king's coat was to carry his honor. Court painters immortalized officers in crisp lines and bright sashes, turning military portraits into symbols of national pride. Foreign envoys reported with a mix of awe and envy that no European power maintained troops so splendidly arrayed or so fiercely loyal. This transformation from ragtag bands to a professional, identically dressed force was not merely cosmetic. It foreshadowed the centralized state that France would become. The uniform was both shield and signature, binding thousands of men to the ambitions of a single monarch. As the 17th century waned and the drums of the next great wars began to beat, France's soldiers marched in unison, their gray-white ranks gleaming under the banners of the Sun King, ready to carry his glory onto every battlefield of Europe and beyond. When French regiments crossed the Atlantic during the long struggle for North America, their presence announced not only military power, but a distinctly European elegance that astonished allies and enemies alike. The flintlock Fusilier and Reliable had by now earned such fame that the men who wielded it were universally called Fusiliers, a name that would echo through the centuries even after the weapon itself became obsolete. In the dense forests and icy rivers of Canada and the Great Lakes, these Fusiliers learned quickly that the powdered wigs and gleaming brass of parade ground splendor had little place in a world of ambush and endless mud. The official uniform remained the gray-white wool coat with colored linings to indicate regiment and rank, but conditions in New France demanded adjustments. Colonial French infantry during the French and Indian War often wore woolen breeches, sturdy stockings, and thick overcoats dyed to withstand harsh winters. Their tricorn hats, iconic under European skies, now braved heavy snows and relentless rain. For sheer practicality, many soldiers carried small hatchets tools as useful for building defenses and chopping firewood as for close-quarters combat. These compact axes, reminiscent of Native American tomahawks, became favored companions, proving far more serviceable than the long, cumbersome swords of Europe. Life on the frontier tested every stitch of a soldier's gear. Supply ships could be delayed for months by storms or privateers forcing garrisons to mend coats with scraps of local cloth or trade with indigenous communities for warm furs. Muskets fouled in the damp cold, and powder had to be kept dry in painstakingly sealed containers. Yet in this crucible of hardship, French troops developed a rugged adaptability that their enemies respected. They learned to move silently through forests, to fight in small, quick-moving detachments, and to build alliances with native tribes who taught them the art of survival in a land of towering pines and endless rivers. Amid these rough realities, rank still mattered. Officers insisted that uniforms remain as close to regulation as possible, even if the threadbare coats were patched with mismatched cloth. To wear the king's colors, however faded, was to stand as an emissary of France in a vast and contested continent. And officers themselves, determined to display the dignity of their station, went to even greater lengths to maintain appearances. High-ranking commanders strode across frozen encampments in striking attire that seemed almost theatrical in such wilderness. They favored coats heavy with gold braiding and wore wide-brimmed chapeaux adorned with sweeping plumes of crimson or white. These flourishes were not mere vanity. In an era when rank was often the difference between order and chaos, such visual cues allowed soldiers to identify leaders instantly in the smoke of battle. A sword still hung from every officer's side, less a weapon than a badge of noble heritage and authority. Imagine the scene at a remote frontier fort, the muffled silence of a snowbound morning broken by the sharp bark of commands in French, Fusiliers standing at attention, their breath clouding the icy air, an officer resplendent in gold trim and a feathered hat inspecting the lines as native allies watch with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. In these moments, the old world's obsession with ceremony met the new world's harsh pragmatism. The contrast between common soldiers and their superiors could be stark. While officers enjoyed better rations and fine fabrics shipped from Europe, enlisted men slept on straw pallets in drafty wooden barracks, their coats stiff with frost and smoke. Yet both shared the same dangers: raiding parties in the night, sudden skirmishes in dense woods, the long agony of supply shortages. Letters home, when they arrived at all, spoke of bitter cold and the eerie cries of wolves beneath the northern lights. The French presence in North America was more than a military venture. It was a cultural encounter that would shape the continent's history. Soldiers not only fought, but traded, hunted, and sometimes married into indigenous communities, leaving behind a legacy of names, customs, and blended traditions. Around campfires, tales of Versailles mingled with stories of the Iroquois, and the uniform of the French Fusilier became a symbol of a far-flung empire at the edge of the known world. Back in Europe, the French army absorbed lessons from these colonial campaigns. Commanders recognized that flexibility and local adaptation were as vital as discipline and drill. The experience of soldiers who had fought in icy forests and humid bayous influenced tactics training and even future uniform designs. By the mid-1700s, France's military reputation rested not only on the grandeur of its parade grounds, but also on the hard-won respect earned in distant, unforgiving theaters of war. As the 18th century advanced, the tension between elegance and practicality, between the glitter of aristocracy and the grit of the common soldier, would continue to shape the evolution of French military dress. The Fusilier, with his patched coat and trusty hatchet, stood as living proof that the ideals of the Sun King could be carried into the wilderness, adapted and even transformed. And in the smoky taverns of Quebec or along the icy banks of the Ohio, one could almost hear the echo of drums from Versailles, a reminder that these men, despite the vast ocean behind them, still marched to the heartbeat of France. While the common Fusilier's uniform grew practical and worn in the forests of North America, the attire of French officers remained a glittering spectacle, a reminder that war was as much about prestige as survival. High-ranking officers of the French and Indian War era were virtual peacocks of the battlefield, their garments proclaiming authority even when mud spattered the hems. Gold braiding traced elaborate patterns across their coats, catching every flicker of firelight during night councils and every shard of winter sun on icy mornings. Wide-brimmed chapeaux, often weighted with sumptuous plumes, dyed crimson, white, or deep blue, crowned their heads, transforming the officers into moving emblems of the Bourbon court. The sword at an officer's hip was rarely drawn in combat. Its true function was symbolic. Forged from fine steel and fitted with ornate guards, it declared the bearer's noble lineage and his permanent claim to leadership. In a skirmish's chaos, smoke from black powder thick as fog drums and war cries echoing through trees, soldiers needed to locate their commanders in an instant. The flash of a gilded scabbard or the white flare of a plume could mean the difference between cohesion and panic. Thus, flamboyance was not mere vanity, but a practical necessity in an age before radios and modern signals. Officers carried themselves accordingly. Diaries from the period reveal a calculated theatricality, boots polished to a mirror sheen, gloves kept immaculately clean even in swamps, and coats brushed before every inspection. They were expected to be living embodiments of the crown's dignity. To appear rumpled or ill-kempt risked undermining not only personal honor, but the entire aura of French authority. A lieutenant in Canada or the Caribbean represented Louis XV as surely as an ambassador in a royal court. Yet such magnificence could also prove fatal. British sharpshooters quickly learned that the officer's bright lace and feathered hat made an irresistible target. In more than one ambush, the opening shot sought the man with the most gold on his coat. French officers knew this, but many refused to dull their colors. To them, death in a blaze of visible courage was preferable to life in obscurity. Their code of honor demanded nothing less. This devotion to display influenced the morale of their troops. Common soldiers, weary from long marches and lean rations, took pride in serving under leaders who carried themselves like knights of old. Seeing their captain stride confidently across a battlefield, sword gleaming despite the mud, reminded them that they were not merely laborers with muskets, but soldiers of a great kingdom. It was a visual contract. The officer would risk becoming a bright target, and in return, the men would follow him into the storm of shot and shell. Back in France, news of colonial exploits, often filtered through romanticized engravings, fed the public's imagination. Artists depicted officers with heroic flare plumes, flowing gold embroidery, radiant swords held high as if conducting a symphony of war. These images circulated through salons and coffee houses, shaping the popular notion of the French officer as both warrior and gentleman, a figure who combined the elan of a courtier with the courage of a soldier. But beneath the grandeur lay the grinding reality of frontier conflict. Officers endured the same biting cold and sudden violence as their men. They slept in drafty forts, dined on coarse bread when supply lines failed, and watched comrades fall to disease and ambush. The delicate gold lace on a coat collar might be stiff with frozen sweat by dawn. And yet, as memoirs attest, many took pride in maintaining elegance amid hardship, believing that composure in adversity proved the superiority of French culture itself. This culture of conspicuous command would influence military fashion for decades, even as practical considerations eventually forced simplification. The idea that an officer should be immediately recognizable and impeccably turned out became a lasting tradition. Later French uniforms, from the tailored blue coats of the Napoleonic era to the horizon blue tunics of World War I, retain this principle: rank must be visible, dignity must be preserved. By the late 1700s, however, the world that had nurtured such aristocratic splendor was beginning to tremble. France itself simmered with unrest. Taxes climbed, bread grew scarce, and revolutionary ideas whispered through the salons of Paris. The ornate coats of the officer class would soon stand as symbols, not only of martial prowess, but of a social order on the brink of collapse. Within a generation, the gleam of gold braid and the rustle of plumes would be swept into the storm of the French Revolution, and the uniform of the king's officer would become both a badge of honor and a mark of danger. As we leave the dense woods of North America and return to a France simmering with change, the image of those proud officers lingers, plumed hats catching the light swords resting easily at their sides. A vision of nobility that could not endure the coming tide. Their brilliance on distant battlefields was real, but it also foreshadowed the clash between the old world of privilege and the new world of equality that waited just beyond the horizon. The final decades of the 18th century carried France toward a reckoning that no plume or gold braid could forestall. Beneath the glittering salons of Paris, resentment brewed like a storm cloud. The monarchy's coffers were drained by costly wars and extravagant court life, while common citizens struggled under crushing taxes and rising bread prices. In such a climate, the immaculate white uniforms of the king's infantry began to feel less like symbols of national pride and more like banners of inequality. Yet the French army of this era was still a spectacle of precision and elegance. Soldiers marched in white turn-back coats that flared smartly over breeches and stockings, their lapels fastened in symmetrical rows of gleaming buttons. Around their necks, they wore the infamous stock, a stiff leather or cloth collar designed to keep the head erect. This constricting band forced a soldier to maintain the ramrod posture beloved by parade ground inspectors, but it was universally despised by those forced to wear it. Veterans joked grimly that the stock was a greater torment than enemy musket fire. The uniform, while striking on the Champs-Élysées, was often impractical in the field. White coats and breeches quickly became magnets for mud and blood, turning gray-brown after a single campaign. Still, officers and tailors insisted on the color's symbolism, purity, discipline, the visible authority of the crown. Drummers in crimson accents beat rhythms that echoed off stone walls as troops paraded through cities, a walking reminder of royal power, even as that power wavered. Behind the spectacle, new ideas were taking root in the barracks. Soldiers, many drawn from the lower classes, heard talk of liberty and rights in taverns and marketplaces. Some officers, educated in Enlightenment philosophy, quietly debated reforms over glasses of wine. The army, long a pillar of royal authority, was becoming an incubator of revolutionary sentiment. It was an age of contrasts. On grand review days, the king's regiments presented a tableau of order and grace, rows of white coats brass gleaming under the sun flags snapping in the breeze. But away from the parade grounds, discontent simmered. Pay was often late, supplies were inconsistent, and the sight of a starving peasant child begging outside the gates of a glittering officers' club left an indelible mark on soldiers who themselves came from humble origins. When the revolution erupted in 1789, uniforms became political statements. The very whiteness that once symbolized royal dignity now made soldiers conspicuous targets for revolutionary mobs. Some units swept up in the fervor adopted tricolor cockades on their hats to show allegiance to the new ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Others remained loyal to the crown and paid for it with their lives. The stock collar, once a badge of discipline, became an emblem of hated authority, and many soldiers tore it off in defiance as barricades rose in the streets of Paris. The revolutionary government quickly recognized the power of dress. A people's army required new colors and new symbols. Blue, long associated with the city of Paris and the broader notion of liberty, replaced the royal white as the dominant hue of French military attire. Red and white, the other shades of the tricolor, found their way into cockades and sashes, turning every soldier into a living embodiment of the revolution's banner. Amid this upheaval, practical needs also shaped change. The wars of the 1790s demanded uniforms that could withstand mud rain and relentless campaigning across Europe. Tailors experimented with stronger fabrics and more functional cuts, while supply officers scrambled to clothe vast citizen armies on a fraction of the old royal budget. The result was a force less ornate but more adaptable, a citizen soldier army that marched not for a king but for a nation. The old royalist officers faced stark choices. Some fled abroad, joining émigré forces, hoping to restore the monarchy. Others, embracing the new order, found themselves commanding troops who only months before might have bowed to them. Battlefield merit began to eclipse noble birth, as the measure of a commander, a shift symbolized by the new, more egalitarian uniforms. Gold braid and ostentatious plumes gave way to practical coats and the bold tricolor cockade. Still, echoes of the past lingered. The revolutionary armies retained certain elements of the old style, lapels, buttons, and the general cut of the coat, even as colors and symbols changed. This blend of continuity and innovation reflected France itself, a nation forging a new identity while carrying the memories of centuries. As the 1790s bled into the dawn of the 19th century, a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte rose swiftly through the ranks. His keen eye for symbolism matched his genius for strategy. Napoleon understood that uniforms were more than clothing. They were banners of morale, tools of propaganda, and instruments of unity. Under his leadership, the French soldier's appearance would again transform, marrying revolutionary vigor with imperial ambition. The pristine white coats of the Ancien Regime faded into history, replaced by the bold blues and strategic practicality that would define the Grande Armée. Yet those earlier garments, those stiff stocks and spotless coats had left their mark. They were the final flourish of a world about to vanish, a reminder of the tension between spectacle and survival, authority and liberty. The revolution's thunder had silenced the old parade drums, but the memory of those immaculate ranks lingered like a ghost in the new republic's marching song. And so, as France stepped into a new century of ambition and conflict, its soldiers wore not only different colors, but a different purpose. No longer mere servants of a king, they were now citizens in arms, ready to defend a nation and an idea. Their uniforms, once the trappings of monarchy, had become the garments of a people determined to remake the world. The dawn of the 19th century ushered in a transformation as dramatic as the revolution itself. Out of the political chaos emerged Napoleon Bonaparte, a soldier of keen intellect, who understood that appearance could inspire as powerfully as artillery. Under his rule, the French army became not only a fighting force, but a living emblem of imperial ambition, and its uniforms reflected that fusion of practicality and grandeur. By 1801, the once ubiquitous white coats of the Ancien Regime had been set aside in favor of deep, confident blue, an unmistakable declaration that France had shed its royal past. The color choice was more than aesthetic. Blue uniforms held up better under the grime of long campaigns, masking dirt and powder, while lending soldiers an air of disciplined resolve. Against the muddy fields of Europe, the French line now appeared as a rolling tide of midnight, accented with the vivid reds and whites of the tricolor. Headgear too evolved. In place of the old tricorn came the shako, a tall cylindrical cap first introduced for light regiments and then adopted across the army by 1807. The shako's leather body and brass plate not only lent soldiers a proud silhouette, but also offered modest protection against saber cuts. Each regiment decorated its shako with distinctive cords, plumes, or cockades, turning the battlefield into a pageant of subtle variations enough to maintain unit identity while still projecting the uniform strength of the Grande Armée. Weapons matched the new look with lethal efficiency. The standard musket, a 17.1mm caliber piece over a meter long, fired with deadly precision at close range and could be fitted with a bayonet for brutal hand-to-hand combat. Elite companies carried a curved saber about 65 centimeters in length, a weapon as suited to cavalry skirmishes as to a last-stand defense in the mud of a rain-soaked field. Napoleon's forces were organized with a sophistication that impressed even their enemies. Among the most admired were the voltigeurs, light skirmishers trained to dart ahead of the main columns, probe enemy lines, and harass opposing troops. Agile and deadly, these soldiers wore green and yellow epaulets that distinguished them from the regular fusiliers. Their bright accents gleamed like flashes of tropical birds in the smoke of battle, a vivid reminder of the army's layered complexity. The Grande Armée's marches became legendary rivers of blue uniforms, moving with mechanical precision across the breadth of Europe. Drums thundered like rolling cannon fire, and the metallic glint of thousands of bayonets turned the sun into a shimmering spectacle. Civilians along the routes often describe the sight as both thrilling and terrifying, a human tide bound by discipline and ambition. Yet, the uniforms were not mere spectacle. Each detail served a purpose. The heavy wool coats provided warmth during the grueling Russian winters and could be rolled into makeshift bedding during overnight bivouacs. Belts and cross straps distributed the weight of ammunition and gear, while brass buttons resisted corrosion. Even the brilliant brass plates on the shako could deflect a glancing saber slash, offering a sliver of extra protection in the chaos of melee. For the men who wore them, these uniforms became part of their identity. Recruits might come from every corner of France or from conquered territories, but the blue coat and shako turned them into soldiers of the empire. Veterans often spoke of a sense of pride that bordered on reverence. The act of buttoning the coat and straightening the plume was a daily ritual that reminded them of their role in Napoleon's vast enterprise. Campaign life tested every seam. On the march to Austerlitz or Wagram, soldiers endured rain that turned roads to rivers of mud and winds that cut like knives across open plains. Coats stiffened with frost by dawn, and the smell of gunpowder and sweat clung to the fabric after battle. Yet, the army maintained strict standards of appearance. Inspections were frequent, and a soldier who allowed his gear to fall into disrepair risked harsh punishment. To Napoleon, a well-kept uniform signaled discipline, and discipline was the lifeblood of victory. The emperor himself paid meticulous attention to his soldiers' attire. Observers noted how he could identify regiments at a glance by the cut of a coat or the color of an epaulette. His presence at reviews, dressed in his own simple gray greatcoat, which made the blue of his troops all the more striking, sent a powerful message. The emperor might appear plain, but his army was the embodiment of imperial glory. Civilians too felt the impact. Markets along the army's routes bustled with tailors and seamstresses producing uniforms, while local children watched wide-eyed as columns of blue passed through their villages. Songs celebrating Les Soldats de Napoleon spread from tavern to tavern, carrying tales of both triumph and tragedy. The uniform became a symbol of French dominance across the continent, feared by opponents and celebrated by allies. But beneath the splendor lay the grinding reality of war. On campaign, soldiers sometimes scavenged for food and patched their coats with whatever cloth they could find. After the disastrous Russian invasion of 1812, survivors returned to France in tattered uniforms. Their once proud blue faded to a ghostly gray. The sight shocked the public and reminded them that even the finest attire could not shield men from frostbite, hunger, or musket fire. Still, the Napoleonic uniform left an indelible mark on military history. Its balance of function and style influenced armies across Europe from Prussia to Spain. The shako, in particular, became a fixture of 19th century military fashion, adopted and adapted by nations eager to capture a fraction of the Grande Armée's aura. By the time of Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, the blue-coated soldiers of France had become legends. Their uniforms told a story of ambition and discipline, of victories won at Austerlitz and lost at Waterloo. More than mere clothing, these garments were the fabric of an era woven from courage, strategy, and the relentless drive of a man who sought to remake Europe. As the cannons fell silent and the Bourbon monarchy returned, the soldiers of the empire carried home memories of battles and bivouacs stitched into their very coats. The blue of Napoleon's army might fade in the wash of time, but its influence endured, shaping the next chapters of French military dress and reminding the world that a uniform can be both a shield and a statement of destiny. Among Napoleon's many creations, none shone brighter literally and figuratively than the Old Guard, the most senior and prestigious corps of grenadiers in the Grande Armée. To the common soldier, they were living legends, the embodiment of iron discipline and unswerving loyalty. To Europe's monarchs, they were a nightmare made flesh, an elite phalanx, whose mere presence could tilt the course of a campaign. Their uniforms proclaimed this supremacy before a single shot was fired. The Old Guard wore bearskin caps so tall and imposing that they added nearly a foot to a grenadier's height. Each was adorned with a gleaming brass plate stamped with the imperial eagle, framed by delicate white cords, and crowned by a brilliant red plume. A crimson patch on the front bore a golden grenade emblem announcing to all that these were the Emperor's chosen men. Their deep blue turn-back coats carried additional gold grenades on the lapels, a striking contrast to the red grenades worn by regular grenadiers. When an Old Guard regiment marched past, the spectacle was unforgettable. A living wall of blue and gold, the red plumes flickering like flames in the sun. Recruitment into this corps demanded more than courage. Candidates had to be veterans of numerous campaigns, stand at least 6 feet tall, a rare height for the era, and possess impeccable records of service. Those who met these standards earned not only the glory of the Old Guard, but also better pay, superior rations, and a measure of reverence from their peers. It was common for younger soldiers to fall silent as these towering figures passed, their brass plates glinting and muskets held with effortless precision. On the battlefield, the Old Guard served as Napoleon's ultimate reserve. He often held them back until a critical moment, then unleashed them like a thunderclap to smash enemy lines or turn a wavering flank. Stories abound of their steadfastness at Austerlitz, Wagram, and countless other fields. They marched into the storm of musket balls and cannon fire with an unbreakable calm, their imposing uniforms making them seem more like mythical warriors than mortal men. Their ceremonial grandeur hid a brutal practicality. The bearskin cap, while dramatic, also provided modest protection against saber cuts, and its thick fur offered insulation in the bitter cold. The heavy blue coats, though ornate, were cut from durable wool that could endure endless campaigns. Every detail combined beauty with function, reflecting Napoleon's understanding that morale and effectiveness were inseparable. Life within the Old Guard carried privileges, but also crushing expectations. Discipline was merciless. A slovenly button or tarnished brass plate could bring swift punishment. Veterans wrote of the pride they felt when donning their uniforms, each brass plate polished to a mirror sheen. To wear the bear, as they called it, was to bear the weight of the Empire's honor. The Old Guard's mystique extended beyond the battlefield. In the streets of Paris, children gazed in awe as they paraded past, their tall caps and crimson plumes towering above the crowd. Foreign visitors recorded their impressions with a mix of admiration and unease, noting that these soldiers seemed to embody the unstoppable will of Napoleon himself. Even in peacetime, their presence sent a political message. The emperor's power rested not only on laws and decrees, but on the silent, disciplined might of these giants in blue and gold. But glory is rarely eternal. When Napoleon's fortunes turned, the Old Guard shared his fate. At Waterloo in 1815, they formed the desperate last square holding off the advancing British and Prussian forces, while the rest of the French army crumbled. Witnesses described a scene of almost theatrical heroism. Smoke-swirling cannon fire thundering the red plumes of the Old Guard standing defiant amid chaos. The Guard dies, but does not surrender, a phrase attributed, though perhaps apocryphally, to their final moments captured the spirit of a corps that would rather be annihilated than dishonored. In the aftermath of defeat, many surviving members became symbols of nostalgia for the Empire's glory days. Veterans wore fragments of their uniforms at public gatherings, the fading blue cloth and tarnished brass, a quiet reminder of a vanished grandeur. The legend of the Old Guard inspired painters and writers for decades, embedding itself in French national memory as the epitome of martial pride and sacrifice. Even after the Bourbon monarchy reclaimed power, the aesthetic legacy of the Old Guard endured. Subsequent generations of French soldiers inherited elements of their dress, the emphasis on striking headgear, the marriage of elegance and function, the belief that a soldier's appearance could shape morale and intimidate foes. The towering bearskin caps in particular influenced ceremonial units across Europe, from Britain's own Grenadier Guards to the Imperial Russian Guard. For historians, the Old Guard offers a vivid lesson in how uniforms can serve as both armor and art. They were not merely soldiers in fancy dress, they were a psychological weapon. The sight of their red plumes advancing through smoke could shake an enemy's resolve before a single volley was fired. And for the men who wore those uniforms, every stitch was a reminder of their elite status, a bond that survived even the collapse of the empire they served. Thus, the Old Guard stands as a dazzling chapter in the story of French military attire. Their ornate bearskins and gleaming brass plates were more than decorations. They were declarations of loyalty, courage, and the enduring power of image in the theater of war. Even today, the phrase "La Vieille Garde" evokes not just a unit of soldiers, but an ideal of steadfastness, a testament to the moment when France's military fashion and its martial spirit marched in perfect step. As the Napoleonic era receded into memory, France turned its gaze outward, building a colonial empire that would span continents. From North Africa to the Caribbean, French influence spread in trade culture and most visibly uniformed soldiers. Among the most striking of these troops were the Zouaves, a unit whose style and fighting spirit left an indelible mark on military history. The Zouaves were originally recruited from the indigenous Kabyle people of Algeria, after France began its conquest of the region in the 1830s. Their name came from a Kabyle tribe, the Zwawa or Zwawa, and their attire was a bold departure from the European norm. Instead of the heavy blue coats and rigid shikos familiar to the armies of Europe, Zouave soldiers wore open-fronted short blue jackets with intricate braiding, loose baggy trousers of brilliant red and wide sashes wound about the waist. On their heads, they balanced the distinctive chechia, a soft tasseled cap of deep crimson that caught the sunlight like a flare. This flamboyant appearance was more than a matter of aesthetics. The light, airy fabric suited the searing North African heat far better than the thick woolen uniforms of France's European regiments. The cut of the trousers allowed free movement in rough terrain, while the bright colors signaled confidence and esprit de corps. French observers were captivated, and before long, metropolitan volunteers clamored to serve in units modeled on these North African warriors. The Zouaves quickly earned a reputation as superb light infantry. Agile and fearless, they excelled in rapid assaults and skirmishes across Algeria's rugged hills. Their dramatic uniforms made them impossible to mistake on the battlefield, and their fierce fighting inspired both admiration and anxiety among opponents. Dispatches from colonial campaigns tell of their relentless charges, the scarlet of their trousers flashing through the dust as they advanced with cries that echoed across the desert. Their fame soon traveled beyond Africa. By the mid-19th century, Zouave units were deployed in conflicts across the French Empire, from the Crimean War to Italy and even Mexico. During the Crimean Campaign of the 1850s, British and Russian soldiers alike marveled at these dashing troops, whose bravery matched their vivid attire. Artists and photographers brought back images of Zouaves standing proudly, with rifles slung over their shoulders, their sashes rippling in the Black Sea wind. In Paris, prints of these exotic warriors sold briskly, feeding a popular fascination that blended military pride with a taste for the romantic and the foreign. The Zouaves example soon influenced armies far beyond France. During the American Civil War, both Union and Confederate regiments formed Zouave companies, adopting their distinctive baggy trousers and short jackets as symbols of daring. For many young soldiers, to don a Zouave-inspired uniform was to claim a lineage of fearless elite fighters. While the Zouaves embodied the colorful side of French colonial warfare, another institution was taking root, one that would become legendary in its own right: the French Foreign Legion. Established in 1831 by King Louis XIV, the Legion was conceived as a way to harness the skills of foreign adventurers and outcasts while keeping them out of metropolitan France. From the beginning, it drew men from every corner of Europe: Germans, Spaniards, Italians, Swiss, creating a uniquely cosmopolitan force bound together by discipline and the promise of redemption. Stationed primarily in Algeria, the Legionnaires wore uniforms influenced by their North African surroundings. Early on, they often adopted elements of the Zouave-style braided jackets, light fabrics, and eventually the white képi with its signature neck flap to ward off the desert sun. Their weapons evolved with the times, but their reputation for endurance and ferocity became their most potent armament. Life in the Foreign Legion was harsh. Recruits, many escaping troubled pasts, endured punishing training and brutal desert campaigns. Yet the Legion became a brotherhood where a man's origins mattered less than his courage. Its unofficial motto, "March or Die," captured the relentless spirit that would carry its soldiers through battles from North Africa to Mexico and beyond. One of the Legion's early tests came during the Second French Intervention in Mexico in the 1860s. Fighting in sweltering heat and rugged terrain, Legionnaires relied on the Model 1859 carbine, a compact weapon suited to guerrilla warfare. Their uniforms often reflected the influence of their North African service, with braided jackets and lightweight fezzes, replacing heavier European gear. The Battle of Cameroon in 1863, where a small Legion detachment held off thousands of Mexican troops, became a foundational legend celebrated every year by Legionnaires around the world. While the Foreign Legion symbolized the hard edge of France's expanding empire, the Zouaves represented its flamboyant face. Together, they illustrated a key theme of 19th century French military culture: adaptability. Whether in the deserts of Algeria, the jungles of Indochina, or the mountains of Mexico, French troops learned to blend European discipline with local knowledge, crafting uniforms and tactics to meet the demands of each theater. Back home, these colonial soldiers captivated the public imagination. Newspapers printed serialized accounts of their exploits, and Parisian children played at being Zouaves or Legionnaires in the streets. Painters depicted them as modern paladins, bold, exotic, and unstoppable. The sight of a Zouave's bright trousers or a Legionnaire's white képi on parade in the capital stirred both patriotic pride and a sense of adventure among the crowds. Yet these colorful units also hinted at the tensions of an expanding empire. Their very existence underscored France's reliance on colonial subjects and foreign recruits to project power across the globe. The vivid uniforms, while inspiring at home, also reflected the complexities of a nation whose soldiers were increasingly drawn from and deployed to lands far from the banks of the Seine. As the 19th century progressed, the French military continued to refine and diversify its attire. Practicality would eventually temper the exuberance of the Zouave style. But for decades, their brilliant reds and blues remained an emblem of France's colonial reach and martial confidence. The Foreign Legion, meanwhile, would outlast empires and revolutions, its white képi becoming one of the most enduring symbols in all of military history. By the time Europe edged toward the industrial conflicts of the late 1800s, these two forces, Zouaves and Legionnaires, had left an indelible mark on French military tradition. They proved that a uniform could be more than a set of clothes. It could be a narrative of cultural exchange, a tool of adaptation, and a banner of courage recognized the world over. The legacy of their vivid dress and fearless reputation set the stage for the next great transformation of French uniforms as the nation prepared to face a new rival on the European continent, a rapidly rising Prussia. By the 1870s, France's attention shifted back to Europe, where a rapidly industrializing Prussia threatened the balance of power. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71 would not only redraw political borders but also usher in a new era of military technology and force the French army to reconsider what its soldiers wore into battle. When hostilities began, the typical French line infantryman cut a striking figure. He wore the képi, a soft, flat-topped cap with a short black peak dyed a brilliant red with blue banding that stood out vividly against the battlefield landscape. His uniform consisted of a dark blue tunic paired with trousers dyed madder red, a color both bold and symbolic of French martial pride. On parade, this combination of deep blue and blazing crimson dazzled the eye. In combat, however, it proved a dangerous liability. Against the greens and browns of European terrain, the bright garments made French soldiers easy targets for the enemy's modern rifles. Those rifles, most notably the Chassepot bolt-action breech-loading weapon, were themselves a leap forward in military technology. With its superior range and accuracy, the Chassepot gave French infantrymen an edge in rate of fire, allowing them to reload far faster than troops armed with older muzzleloaders. In theory, the rifle's advanced design should have balanced the battlefield. In practice, the brilliance of the uniforms often betrayed the men who carried it. Prussian sharpshooters could pick out the gleam of a képi or the flash of red trousers long before a French soldier glimpsed their gray-green counterparts. French commanders defended the flamboyant dress as a matter of tradition and morale. Red trousers, they insisted, were the glory of France, a living emblem of the revolutionary spirit. Newspapers echoed this sentiment, proclaiming that the army's colors embodied courage itself. But the industrial battlefield cared little for romance. Where once armies had faced each other in smoke-filled lines, at close range the new age of rifled barrels and long-distance artillery rewarded concealment. Every bright thread became a target. As the campaign unfolded, the limitations of the old style grew painfully clear. French troops marched across muddy fields and through shell-torn villages, their once vivid trousers dulled to brown by dirt but still bright enough to draw a fire. The képi, light and jaunty, offered no protection against shrapnel or the biting chill of night. And while the Chassepot rifle performed admirably logistical failures, poor coordination of rail transport, inadequate supply lines often left soldiers undersupplied with the very cartridges they needed to exploit their weapons' potential. The war itself was a crucible of change. French forces fought with stubborn bravery at battles such as Sedan and Gravelotte, but Prussia's efficient mobilization and superior artillery overwhelmed them. The siege of Paris in the winter of 1870-71 ended in surrender and humiliation. In the aftermath, many officers admitted that the army's conspicuous uniforms had turned their men into silhouettes against the smoke and snow-easy marks for Prussian gunners. Yet the story of the Franco-Prussian War is not only one of defeat. Within the French ranks, tales of valor and endurance abounded. Soldiers spoke of comrades who stood fast under relentless bombardment of sharpshooters who wielded the Chassepot with deadly precision of regiments that fought to the last cartridge. The contrast between their courage and their outdated attire underscored a lesson that would shape the army's future. Bravery alone could not overcome the demands of modern warfare. After the war, debates over military dress raged in the National Assembly and in the press. Some traditionalists clung to the red trousers as a national symbol too sacred to abandon. Others, especially younger officers hardened by the campaign, argued for uniforms that favored survival over spectacle. Gradually, practicality began to win. Experiments with subtler shades of blue and eventually drab khaki reflected a grudging acknowledgement that camouflage had become as vital as courage. Even as France licked its wounds, the global reach of its forces continued to expand. The defeat in Europe spurred a renewed focus on overseas colonies, where lessons from the war would influence the equipment of soldiers stationed in far-flung outposts. In Vietnam, for example, the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps, adopted the lightweight M78 colonial helmet designed to shield troops from the blistering sun while offering modest protection from blows. Their uniforms, blue tunics or white trousers depending on climate-paired function with the symbolic link to the homeland. A black belt with twin pouches held ammunition and rations, allowing soldiers to endure the steamy jungles and unpredictable rains of Southeast Asia. These colonial troops represented a new chapter in the story of French military attire, one of adaptation to diverse environments. In the humid river deltas of Indochina, heavy European wool gave way to breathable cotton. The kepi often sprouted a neck flap to protect from sunstroke. Boots were lightened belts, widened and gear adjusted to withstand monsoon downpours. The army that had once marched proudly across European fields in blazing red now learned to fight in dense green forests and on muddy riverbanks. At home, the debate over uniforms remained unresolved well into the 1880s. Public opinion, still bruised by defeat, oscillated between nostalgia and pragmatism. Patriotic posters continued to depict soldiers in the heroic red and blue of the past, while military planners quietly tested more subdued fabrics. The tension reflected a deeper struggle how to honor the glories of revolutionary and Napoleonic tradition while embracing the realities of industrial warfare. This period also saw significant advances in weaponry and tactics that would further influence uniform design. Repeating rifles and early machine guns demanded soldiers move and fire more dynamically, favoring lighter, less restrictive clothing. Protective headgear began to receive renewed attention as artillery shells grew more lethal. The lessons of Sedan and the Siege of Paris echoed in every discussion. Visibility could be fatal. Mobility and protection were paramount. Through all these changes, one truth endured: the uniform remained a potent symbol of national identity. Whether in the bright kepis of the Franco-Prussian War or the practical colonial gear of the Tonkin Campaign, what a French soldier wore carried meaning far beyond the battlefield. Each stitch told a story of pride, adaptation, and the constant dialogue between tradition and necessity. As the 19th century neared its end, the French army stood at a crossroads. The memory of dazzling red trousers persisted in popular imagination, but the next major conflict would demand something altogether different. Industrialized warfare was advancing with relentless speed, and the vivid hues of old would soon give way to tones better suited to the mud smoke and mechanized destruction of the coming century. The Franco-Prussian War had been a painful teacher, but its lessons would shape the evolution of French military attire for decades. In the jungles of Asia and the deserts of Africa, in the design studios of Paris, and the training fields of the new Third Republic, the army was already preparing slowly, sometimes reluctantly, for the age of modern war. In the years after the Franco-Prussian War, France sought to rebuild its prestige through colonial expansion, and the army's uniforms evolved to meet the demands of distant, punishing climates. The late 19th century saw French troops deploying from the dry Sahel to the steamy deltas of Southeast Asia, each environment forcing fresh adaptations in fabric cut and equipment. Among the most notable expeditions was the Tonkin Campaign in northern Vietnam, where the French sought to secure a protectorate and extend their influence in Indochina. Colonial challenges and new gear. The men of the Tonkin Expeditionary Corps, a blend of Marine infantry and colonial units, faced an environment utterly unlike the muddy plains of Europe. Dense jungles, searing humidity, and sudden monsoon rains made heavy wool uniforms unbearable and even dangerous. To combat the equatorial sun, soldiers were issued the distinctive Model 1978 colonial helmet, a light cork-based headpiece sheathed in white cloth. The helmet's broad brim deflected both sunlight and tropical downpours, while a simple chin strap kept it secure during long marches through mountain passes and river deltas. Their clothing reflected similar practicality. Troops often wore lightweight white cotton trousers paired with dark or sky blue tunics that dried quickly and allowed ventilation. A broad black leather belt equipped with 2 ammunition pouches crossed the waist for easy access to cartridges. Mosquito netting and gaiters completed the ensemble, offering some protection from insects and the leeches that infested swampy trails. Compared to the stiff red trousers of the Franco-Prussian era, these uniforms represented a radical shift toward utility. Blending cultures in the field. Campaign life in Tonkin fostered a fascinating blend of cultures. French officers sometimes adopted locally made sandals or loose-fitting shirts to cope with the heat, while Vietnamese auxiliaries wore a hybrid of native dress and French gear. Photographs from the 1880s show columns of troops wear pith helmets sit above both European tunics and traditional Annamite garments. In garrison towns such as Hanoi and Haiphong, tailors produced uniforms from imported cloth, as well as local silk, creating subtle regional variations that added to the visual tapestry of the colonial army. Despite the harsh conditions, these troops carried modern weapons for the time. Many were armed with the Gras rifle, a single-shot bolt-action firing an 11mm cartridge, and later the more advanced Kropatschek repeating rifle. Leather bandoliers and bayonets completed their equipment. The combination of modern firepower and adaptive clothing allowed French forces to move with speed and efficiency through the challenging terrain. Expansion across the empire. The lessons learned in Tonkin informed French military attire across the empire. In Madagascar, West Africa, and the Caribbean, soldiers required garments that balanced European discipline with tropical practicality. By the 1890s, light cotton or linen uniforms, often dyed a pale khaki or horizon blue for subtle camouflage, became common for colonial troops. The once ubiquitous scarlet trousers gave way to more subdued tones that concealed dust and dirt, while reducing the heat absorbed under a brutal sun. In North Africa, where France maintained a strong presence in Algeria and Tunisia, the Zouaves continued to dazzle with their crimson trousers and blue jackets. But even they adopted lighter fabrics and optional neck flaps to survive the Sahara's scorching winds. The Foreign Legion, hardened by decades of desert warfare, also began wearing khaki cotton shirts and white-covered kepis, a look that would become iconic. Photographs from the late 19th century show legionnaires resting beneath date palms, their pale uniforms dusted with sand, their rifles leaning against crumbling adobe walls. Symbolism and public perception. Back in Paris, these new colonial uniforms captured the public imagination. Illustrated magazines like Le Monde Illustré published engravings of soldiers in exotic settings, Tonkinese riverbanks, Algerian Kasbahs, or West African forts. To the French public, the white helmets and khaki tunics symbolized both the far reach of the Republic and the ingenuity of its soldiers. Children played at being petits légionnaires, while music halls staged colonial tableaux featuring actresses in miniature pith helmets and braided jackets. Yet the colonial army was not merely a parade of costumes. It was a crucible of tactics and technologies that foreshadowed the challenges of modern warfare. Skirmishes with well-armed local resistance fighters taught officers the value of camouflage mobility and lightweight gear lessons that would resonate decades later in the trenches of Europe. The Model 1878 helmet, for example, inspired future designs for steel combat helmets, demonstrating that the drive to protect soldiers' heads from sun and shrapnel was already underway. Tensions of empire. Amid the pageantry, the reality of empire was complex and often brutal. Uniforms that fascinated Parisians also signified colonial domination to the people of Indochina, North Africa, and West Africa. Local recruits known as tirailleurs wore variations of French uniforms, sometimes incorporating traditional sashes or turbans, a visual reminder of the cultural collisions at the heart of empire. These soldiers fought bravely in campaigns far from home, yet their service was entwined with the politics of occupation and resistance, preparing for a new century. As the 19th century closed, the French army faced a world transformed by industrial technology. Railroads allowed rapid troop movements, telegraphs, sped communication, and repeating rifles increased the tempo of combat. Military planners recognized that the bright hues of earlier decades were ill-suited to the age of smokeless powder and long-range artillery. Trials of New Horizon blue dyes and khaki fabrics accelerated, and designers experimented with stronger boots, better webbing, and protective leggings to support the foot soldiers of the coming century. In the colonies, incremental improvements continued. Some units replaced the white cotton trousers with khaki breeches to better hide stains and offer a modicum of camouflage in jungle or desert. Tropical helmets gained reinforced frames and detachable neck curtains. Lightweight wool-cotton blends allowed garments to dry faster and resist mildew. Officers encouraged soldiers to carry extra water in specially designed canteens, anticipating the supply challenges of future wars in arid regions. The Tonkin Expeditionary Corps, though only one chapter in France's colonial saga, symbolized this transitional era. Their equipment and intentional fusion of European discipline and local necessity bridged the gap between the romantic but impractical uniforms of earlier decades and the scientifically designed battle dress of the 20th century. Veterans of Tonkin returned to France with hard-won experience that influenced military doctrine for years to come, from the design of tropical gear to the emphasis on mobile small unit tactics. By the dawn of the 20th century, the soldiers of the French Third Republic marched into a new century clad in uniforms that told a story of adaptation and ambition. The gleaming red trousers of earlier generations still appeared on ceremonial occasions, a nod to tradition and national pride. But the practical whites, khakis, and horizon blues of colonial service were becoming the true face of the French army. These garments, shaped by the rains of Vietnam, the sands of Algeria, and the feverish heat of West Africa, foreshadowed the hard lessons that awaited on the battlefields of Europe, where camouflage, protection, and mobility would mean the difference between life and death. When the guns of August 1914 roared to life, French soldiers marched into the First World War, wearing uniforms that were in many respects relics of the 19th century. The typical infantrymen of the early months, known affectionately and ironically as the poilu, or hairy one, wore a dark blue wool coat and the iconic madder red trousers that politicians and generals had defended as a sacred national tradition. Newspapers boasted that the red trousers were France itself, a vibrant emblem of revolutionary pride and martial courage. Yet these same trousers made soldiers painfully visible against the green-brown landscapes of Belgium and northern France, turning them into targets for German riflemen equipped with modern optics and long-range weapons. The reality of modern firepower. The early battles of 1914, Marne-Charleroi, the Ardennes, were a baptism of fire for an army steeped in old ideals. The French soldier carried the Molo 1886 Lebel rifle, the first standard infantry weapon to use smokeless powder. It was powerful but long awkward in the confined trenches that soon defined the war. Bright blue coats and scarlet trousers, magnificent in a parade, became deadly liabilities under machine gun fire and high explosive shells. Letters from the front tell of men grimly joking that their uniforms seemed designed to please the enemy's marksmen. As casualties mounted, the need for change became undeniable. By late 1914, military planners authorized the introduction of the horizon blue uniform, a muted gray blue that blended far better with smoke mud and shattered woodland. Factories across France rushed to produce millions of sets, and by 1915, the old red trousers were largely gone from the front. The new coats, trousers, and puttees cloth leggings wrapped from ankle to knee reflected a decisive shift from showy tradition to pragmatic survival. The birth of the Adrian helmet. The First World War also heralded the age of protective headgear. Artillery shells rained lethal fragments, and head wounds became a grim hallmark of the trenches. In 1915, France became the first major power to issue a steel combat helmet, the Model 1915 Adrian. Lightweight yet effective against shrapnel, the Adrian featured a distinctive crest running from front to back, originally intended to deflect debris. Painted the same horizon blue as the uniforms, it bore a stamped insignia, flaming grenade for infantry anchor for Marines, or a winged propeller for aviation units, allowing instant recognition of a soldier's branch. The Adrian's impact was immediate. Reports showed a significant drop in fatal head injuries, and soldiers, initially skeptical of the new gear, soon prized the helmet as essential. Photographs from Verdun and the Somme capture ranks of weary poilus with steel helmets tilted at jaunty angles, a symbol of France's adaptation to industrial warfare. Life in the trenches. Uniforms were only part of the soldier's struggle. The horizon blue wool coats, while less conspicuous, still soaked up rain and mud, becoming heavy as lead in the cold, wet trenches. Soldiers wrapped their lower legs in puttees, long strips of cloth, borrowed from British practice to keep out muck and add warmth. Leather boots, often ill-suited to the endless moisture, cracked and rotted. Many soldiers improvised lining boots with newspaper or scavenged cloth to ward off frostbite. The smell of damp wool, gun oil, and unwashed bodies became the very scent of war. Letters and diaries describe uniforms stiff with dried mud lice-infested seams and the constant battle to stay dry amid the ceaseless drizzle. Yet these same garments, uncomfortable as they were, offered a small measure of comfort and unity. To don the horizon blue was to become part of a brotherhood enduring unimaginable hardship. The French Air Service. While the infantry slogged through the mud, a new branch of warfare was taking shape in the skies. The French Air Service, formally established in 1910 but rapidly expanded after 1914, required its own specialized clothing. Pilots still wore blue army uniforms but layered them with thick wool overcoats, leather flight helmets, and heavy goggles to withstand the icy winds of open cockpit biplanes. Photographs of aces like Georges Guynemer show aviators bundled against the cold scarves, trailing dramatically as they climbed into fragile wooden aircraft. These pioneers of air combat blended old-world gallantry with cutting-edge technology, their uniforms a testament to the rapid evolution of war, identity, and morale. Despite the hardships, the horizon blue uniform became an enduring symbol of French resolve. Painters like Georges Scott captured the heroic silhouette of the poilu with his Adrian helmet and rugged coat, a figure at once ordinary and monumental. In cafes far from the front, civilians wore horizon blue ribbons or cockades to show solidarity with the troops. Children collected discarded shell casings and helmet crests as keepsakes, turning the soldiers' gear into cherished relics of national sacrifice. The uniform also reinforced the Republican ideal that every citizen could be a defender of the nation. Unlike the ornate dress of the Napoleonic Old Guard, horizon blue was egalitarian, simple, functional, and worn by millions of men from every region and class. It spoke of unity rather than privilege, of collective endurance rather than individual glory. Global reach and colonial troops. France's colonial empire contributed hundreds of thousands of soldiers to the war effort, and their uniforms reflected both French standards and regional adaptations. North African tirailleurs wore horizon blue tunics, but often retained traditional sashes or turbans. Senegalese infantry combined French equipment with their distinctive fezzes. These soldiers fought bravely on the Western Front, and in other theaters, their presence reminding the world of France's vast imperial reach. Legacy of the Great War uniform. By the armistice of 1918, the image of the horizon blue poilu was etched into French memory. Veterans returning home wore their Adrian helmets in victory parades, while artists and sculptors immortalized the figure in countless monuments. The design's influence extended far beyond France. Many nations adopted steel helmets modeled on the Adrian, and the concept of drab concealing colors became standard military practice worldwide. The transformation from red trousers to horizon blue marked more than a change in dye. It represented a cultural shift from the romantic wars of the 19th century to the mechanized slaughter of the 20th. The French army had learned at terrible cost that survival depended on practicality, protection, and the ability to blend into the ruined landscape of modern battle. As the 1920s dawned, France faced the challenge of rebuilding and remembering. Veterans cherished their horizon blue coats and Adrian helmets as symbols of sacrifice, while the nation debated how to honor the millions who had fought and died. Though later uniforms would adopt new shades and fabrics, the horizon blue of World War I remained a potent emblem of courage and adaptation in the face of unprecedented destruction. While millions of French infantrymen slogged through the mud of Flanders and Champagne, a quieter revolution was taking place in the skies. The French Air Service, officially established in October 1910 and expanded dramatically after 1914, became one of the world's pioneering air forces. Its pilots were true trailblazers, confronting the perils of flight at a time when aviation was scarcely a decade old. Their uniforms and gear reflected both the daring of early aviators and the harsh realities of high-altitude combat. Early flight attire. Unlike the ground troops who wore the now famous horizon blue coats, pilots needed clothing that could withstand sub-zero temperatures and fierce winds at altitudes exceeding 3,000 meters. Most began with the standard Army blue uniform as a base layer, but it was quickly buried beneath layers of thick wool-lined overcoats. To combat the frigid slipstream and open cockpits, aviators donned heavy leather jackets, fur collars, and bulky gloves. Scarves, often gifts from loved ones, were more than sentimental keepsakes. They kept necks warm and prevented chafing from the constant head swiveling required in dogfights. Headgear was equally critical. Pilots wore padded leather flying helmets snug enough to block the roar of engines and shield ears from the cold. Tight-fitting goggles protected eyes from wind blast and the fine grit of castor oil spewed by the rotary engines. Photographs of celebrated aces such as Georges Guynemer or Charles Nungesser show them wrapped like Arctic explorers, their breath frosting in the thin air before takeoff. Symbolism and style. Despite the utilitarian layers, French aviators retained a certain Gallic flair. Many wrapped long white silk scarves around their necks, ends trailing dramatically as they walked across airfields, an image that soon became an emblem of romantic aerial chivalry. Squadron insignia, often painted by hand on aircraft fuselages, carried over to patches on flight coats, storks, comets, and mythical creatures signaled unit pride and personal daring. These details, while small, turned each pilot into a living icon of modern heroism. The birth of aerial combat. The air service began as a reconnaissance arm, its pilots tasked with photographing enemy positions and relaying artillery coordinates. But necessity bred innovation. By 1915, pilots were mounting machine guns on their fragile biplanes, transforming observation flights into deadly duels. Uniforms adapted accordingly. Leather gauntlets were reinforced, and some pilots strapped sidearms or lightweight carbines to their belts for last resort defense should they be forced down behind enemy lines. Flying was perilous in the extreme. Open cockpits offered no protection from bullets or shrapnel, and early aircraft were prone to engine failure. Pilots often carried Lucky Charms, a child's toy, a lover's ribbon sewn into jacket linings. Their uniforms, stiff with cold and engine oil, absorbed the scent of castor fuel and the constant vibration of the airframe. Surviving pilots later spoke of the peculiar mix of exhilaration and dread each time they zipped their heavy leather coats before a mission. Ground crew and support. The aviation revolution also reshaped the attire of ground crews and mechanics. These men wore modified army blues or dark coveralls streaked with oil, along with Adrian helmets adapted with aviation insignia. They braved icy winds to refuel planes and patch bullet holes, their uniforms stained with grease and cordite. In their own way, they too became symbols of the new industrial war, fusing the craftsman's skill with the soldier's discipline. Public fascination. Back home, the exploits of French pilots captured the public imagination. Newspapers published breathless accounts of dogfights high above the trenches, and postcards featured portraits of aces in their distinctive gear. Children tied white scarves around their necks and pretended to steer imaginary aircraft across Parisian courtyards. The flight uniform, leather jacket, helmet, and goggles became shorthand for technological daring and youthful courage. Legacy of the early Air Force. The influence of these pioneering uniforms persisted long after the armistice. Interwar flight jackets, bomber coats, and even civilian fashion borrowed elements from the leather and fur ensembles of World War I aviators. The French Air Service had not only helped secure victory, but also defined an enduring image of the aviator as both modern warrior and romantic adventurer. As the 1920s dawned, France faced the immense task of rebuilding after the Great War's devastation. Its soldiers returned home in horizon blue uniforms that now symbolized sacrifice and unity. Yet the interwar years brought new challenges and another transformation in military attire, from blue to khaki. In the 1930s, military planners recognized that the bright horizon blue, while iconic, no longer met the tactical demands of mechanized warfare. Tests with khaki and field gray fabrics began aiming for better concealment amid the varied landscapes of Europe. By the eve of World War II, the French army had adopted a more subdued khaki field uniform, coupled with an updated version of the Adrian helmet, the model 1926. This helmet retained the familiar crest, but offered improved protection and a slightly lower silhouette, better suited to the fast-moving conflicts that strategists now anticipated. Equipment modernized as well. Webbing systems were redesigned for greater comfort and to distribute weight evenly as soldiers carried heavier ammunition loads and new automatic weapons. Boots improved with tougher soles and better waterproofing lessons learned from the soaked trenches of the previous war. Shadows of a new conflict. By 1939, when German forces threatened Europe once again, French troops marched in these khaki uniforms, practical, unassuming, and a far cry from the scarlet and blue spectacle of 1914. Yet the spirit of adaptation forged in the skies and trenches of the First World War endured. Veterans recognized the symbolism. France had moved from the bright banners of the 19th century to the understated resilience of a modern army. The interwar period thus stands as a bridge between eras. The leather-clad aviators and horizon blue infantry of World War I had demonstrated that survival demanded innovation. Their uniforms told a story of courage, ingenuity, and the relentless push to match clothing to the evolving art of war, a story that would continue as France braced for the next great trial of the 20th century. The uneasy peace of the interwar years ended abruptly in September 1939, when Germany's invasion of Poland plunged Europe into another cataclysm. France entered World War II with an army clothed in the practical khaki field uniforms adopted after World War I and equipped with an updated Model 1926 Adrian helmet, a slightly lower profile, sturdier evolution of the celebrated Great War design. These garments represented decades of adaptation. Gone were the flamboyant reds and blues of the 19th century, replaced by muted tones meant to blend into the mechanized battlefield. Yet the challenge ahead would test even these modern improvements. Early campaigns and the fall of France. French infantry of 1939-40 carried the reliable MAS-36 bolt-action rifle and marched in olive-drab tunics with matching trousers. Leather boots were treated for water resistance, and new webbing systems distributed the weight of ammunition pouches, grenades, and entrenching tools. The Adrian helmet remained a defining silhouette, now painted matte khaki or horizon gray, depending on the unit. Soldiers also wore simple wool greatcoats for winter campaigns, a far cry from the heavy blue capes of the Great War, but still cumbersome in the mud of northern France. Despite these updates, the rapid German blitzkrieg overwhelmed French defenses in the spring of 1940. When the Third Republic capitulated in June, the army splintered into two distinct forces, whose uniforms told sharply different stories: the Vichy French Army and the Free French Forces. Vichy France, old and new, collide. Under the terms of the armistice, the collaborationist Vichy regime was permitted to maintain a limited military presence. These troops wore a patchwork of equipment: pre-war French khaki leftover Model 1940 helmets, and increasingly captured German gear, including the unmistakable Stahlhelm in various pre-war patterns. Photographs from this period show soldiers in a curious hybrid of French and German attire, an unsettling visual metaphor for the nation's political subjugation. Officers sometimes retain the Adrian helmet for ceremonial duties, but field units frequently mixed German tunics and webbing with French boots and belts. This amalgamation highlighted the shortages and compromises of an army constrained by occupation and dependent on German goodwill. Free French Forces identity through adaptation. Far different were the uniforms of the Forces Françaises Libres, FFL, the Free French who rallied to General Charles de Gaulle in exile. Operating alongside British and later American troops in North Africa, the Middle East, and Europe, these soldiers relied heavily on Allied supplies. Their appearance often mirrored that of their partners. British khaki battle dress, American M1 helmets, and US webbing became common sights. To distinguish themselves from their Anglo-Saxon allies, Free French soldiers adopted symbolic touches. The most famous was the Cross of Lorraine, a double-barred cruciform badge worn on the lapel or helmet as a proud declaration of French resistance. Some units added tricolor shoulder patches or small national flags stitched to tunics. These subtle details turned otherwise generic Allied uniforms into unmistakably French statements of defiance. Colonial contributions. France's global empire again played a crucial role. Troops from North and West Africa, Indochina, and the Pacific Islands joined the Free French cause, bringing their own cultural influences to the battlefield. Senegalese tirailleurs, Moroccan goumiers, and Malagasy infantry fought from the deserts of Libya to the mountains of Italy, often wearing standard British khaki but incorporating traditional sashes or distinctive headgear like turbans or fezzes. Their presence reinforced the truly global nature of the struggle and added vibrant diversity to Free French ranks. Resistance in the shadows. Inside occupied France, the Maquis and other resistance groups waged guerrilla warfare in whatever clothing they could find. At first, there were no uniforms, only armbands or discreet pins signifying allegiance when needed. As Allied airdrops increased in 1943–44, partisans began to receive standardized pieces, such as British battle dress jackets, berets, and boots. But the essence of their identity remained the simple Cross of Lorraine armband. For these fighters, a scrap of cloth could be as powerful a uniform as any formal tunic. Liberation and beyond. By the time of the Normandy landings in 1944, many Free French units were outfitted almost entirely in American gear. M1941 field jackets, M1 steel helmets, and US webbing. Yet even amid this standardization, the French insistence on unique insignia remained strong. The 2nd Armored Division under General Leclerc, for example, wore American uniforms adorned with French flags on the shoulder and the Cross of Lorraine emblazoned on tanks and helmets. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, jubilant crowds cheered columns of Free French soldiers who looked at first glance like Americans until one noticed the subtle French markings. Their very appearance told a story of international cooperation and national survival. Post-war transition. After victory in 1945, France faced the challenge of rebuilding its own independent military identity. Wartime scarcity had forced practicality. Uniforms were a blend of French tradition and Allied influence. In the late 1940s, designers began reintroducing specifically French elements, refining the cut of tunics and updating insignia while retaining lessons learned about camouflage and comfort. The Adrian helmet, though iconic, finally gave way to newer steel helmets, inspired by American and British designs. Webbing systems were modernized to carry heavier automatic weapons, and lightweight tropical uniforms were developed for colonial conflicts already brewing in Indochina and North Africa. Legacy of the Wovyewu uniforms. World War II cemented the idea that a uniform is more than fabric, and buttons, it is a political statement. The patchwork worn by Vichy troops revealed compromise and collaboration, while the hybrid Allied gear of the Free French symbolized resilience and global partnership. The Cross of Lorraine, once an obscure heraldic symbol, became synonymous with national defiance still honored today in French military insignia. As the 1940s closed, the French soldier's wardrobe reflected a century of hard lessons, from the bright, vulnerable reds of the 19th century to the khaki practicality of modern mechanized war, from colonial pith helmets to the universal steel shell. Each change told of adaptation under pressure and the unyielding will to remain distinctly French, even when clad in the garments of allies. The next chapters, Indochina, Algeria, and the Cold War, would continue to refine this balance of tradition and innovation, but the crucible of World War II had already proven that the meaning of a uniform lies not only in how it shields the body, but in how it speaks to the world about a nation's resolve. With the Second World War barely concluded, France found itself once again drawn into conflict, this time in its far-flung colonies. The post-war years were an era of rapid technological change and geopolitical tension, and French military attire evolved accordingly, blending lessons from two world wars with the unique demands of tropical battlefields and modern counterinsurgency. Indochina, the Jungle Laboratory, 1946 to 1954. Almost immediately after World War II, France faced a determined independence movement in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. The humid jungles of Indochina punished soldiers and equipment alike. The French Expeditionary Corps adopted a mix of wartime American surplus and newly designed tropical uniforms. Lightweight M47 fatigues in shades of olive or khaki became standard, often worn with British-style bush hats or the familiar white-covered keepee of the Foreign Legion. Foot soldiers carried the MAS-36 bolt-action rifle, a durable but aging weapon, while elite units received US M1 carbines or Thompson submachine guns delivered through post-war aid programs. Canvas webbing replaced heavy leather belts to prevent rot in the steamy climate. Soldiers improvised constantly rolling sleeves to ward off heat, waterproofing boots with candle wax and wrapping scarves to keep leeches from crawling beneath collars. The Foreign Legion, still the most storied arm of the French forces, retained its aura of grit and cosmopolitanism. Legionnaires in Indochina often wore the classic white keepee during ceremonial occasions, but switched to bush hats or steel helmets in the field. Photographs from Dien Bien Phu show a striking melange. French jackets, US web gear, British boots, visual proof that practicality outweighed uniformity. Algeria, from olive drab to lizard camo, 1954-1962. No sooner had the Indochina War ended than another erupted closer to home. In Algeria's rugged mountains and sun-scorched plains, the French army fought a long and bitter counterinsurgency. The conflict demanded uniforms suited to searing heat by day and biting cold by night. By the mid-1950s, the Army introduced the ML4756 lizard camouflage pattern, a striking design of green and brown brushstrokes on a tan background. This was France's first widespread use of true camouflage clothing and quickly became iconic. Light, durable trousers paired with matching blouses allowed soldiers to blend into rocky hillsides and scrub forests where the FLN guerrillas waged their campaign. On their feet, troops wore patagas, canvas, and rubber shoes, prized for their grip and breathability in rough terrain. Paratroopers and commandos combined the lizard camo with black leather jump boots and distinctive red berets, projecting an elite image while maintaining stealth. Weapons and gear were equally varied. Alongside the trusty MAS-36, soldiers used captured German MP-40s, American Garands, and the French MAT-49 submachine gun. Webbing was lightweight canvas, often locally manufactured to meet constant demand. Soldiers learned to carry extra water in double canteens and to adapt to ambush warfare, where heat dust and sudden violence were constant companions. The lizard pattern soon achieved global fame. Its effectiveness and striking look inspired militaries from Portugal to Vietnam and influenced later US camouflage experiments. For France, it marked a turning point. Uniforms were now tools of concealment, first symbols second. The birth of the famous era. As the 1960s progressed and the Algerian conflict ended, France reorganized its armed forces for the Cold War. Olive drab remained the dominant color for field wear, but fabric technology improved. Ripstop cotton blends replaced heavier weaves, and combat boots incorporated modern rubber soles for better traction. By the late 1970s, France adopted the famous F1 assault rifle, a sleek bullpup-style weapon reflecting cutting-edge design. To complement this modernization, the Army issued the Model 1978 composite helmet, offering improved ballistic protection and a snug ergonomic fit. Standard uniforms were a practical mix of olive drab and khaki, echoing NATO allies, while retaining distinctly French tailoring. Soldiers carried new load-bearing vests that distributed weight evenly across the torso, another lesson from years of colonial campaigning. Special Forces and the rise of the GIGN. The shifting nature of warfare, terrorism, hostage crises, and urban conflict also spurred the creation of specialized units. In 1974, France established the Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale (GIGN), an elite counterterrorism and hostage rescue force. GIGN operators wore dark blue tactical suits reinforced with Kevlar panels and outfitted with multiple pouches for ammunition, flashbangs, and breaching tools. Their gear included bullet-resistant inserts, night vision equipment, and advanced communications headsets. For ceremonial occasions or non-combat duties, they sported the distinctive dark blue beret of the National Gendarmerie, instantly recognizable in photos of high-profile operations from the 1970s onward. The GIGN's cutting-edge equipment reflected a new reality. Warfare was no longer confined to trenches or jungles. Urban environments hijacked aircraft, and sudden terror attacks demanded uniforms that combined ballistic protection flexibility and the ability to carry sophisticated electronics. Toward the 21st century. By the 1990s and early 2000s, the French army fielded soldiers clad in Central Europe CE camouflage, a woodland pattern suited to NATO deployments in the Balkans and beyond. Kevlar helmets replaced older composites, and body armor with ceramic plates became standard. Moisture-wicking undershirts, Gore-Tex rain gear, and modular webbing reflected the influence of global technological advances. The culmination of decades of innovation arrived with the FÉLIN system Fantassin à équipement et liaison intégré, introduced in the late 2000s. This integrated soldier ensemble combined a Spectra helmet fitted with night vision optics, body armor with hard ballistic plates, GPS communications, and a modified FAMAS rifle with thermal sights. The uniform itself featured flame-retardant fabrics and built-in wiring for electronics, turning each infantryman into a node in a digital battlefield network. A living tradition. Despite this high-tech evolution, ceremonial units continued to honor history. The Saint-Cyr Military Academy, France's equivalent of West Point or Sandhurst, preserved a dress uniform of dark blue with crimson epaulettes and a pale blue shako capped by a bold red and white plume, a deliberate echo of Napoleonic grandeur. On Bastille Day, these cadets parade down the Champs-Élysées, their ornate attire reminding onlookers of centuries of military tradition. Foreign legionnaires also maintain their iconic white capey green epaulettes and blue sash during formal occasions. These garments, rooted in 19th century colonial campaigns, provide a living link to the past even as the Legion fights with 21st century weapons. Lessons of a century. From the humid jungles of Indochina to the high-tech battlefields of the modern era, each iteration of French military dress reflects a story of adaptation. The white M78 colonial helmets of the Tonkin expedition, the bold lizard camo of Algeria, the olive drab of the Cold War, and the dark blue tactical gear of the GIGN all testify to a single lesson. Uniforms are tools of survival and instruments of identity. They must shield soldiers from climate terrain and enemy fire. They must carry the weight of history and the pride of a nation. Through 2 world wars and countless colonial conflicts, the French armed forces have continually balanced tradition and innovation, proving that what a soldier wears is far more than mere clothing. It is the fabric of strategy, culture, and national memory. By the late 1970s, France stood at the threshold of a modern era, defined by rapid technological advances and changing geopolitical threats. The nation's soldiers, once clad in bright scarlet trousers or horizon blue wool, now required uniforms that could adapt to an unpredictable world of mechanized warfare, counterinsurgency, and counterterrorism. The decades that followed saw the French armed forces refine their gear for global missions, merging hard-won lessons from colonial campaigns with the demands of Cold War readiness. The FAMAS generation. In 1978, the French Army formally adopted the famous F1 assault rifle, a distinctive bullpup-style weapon that symbolized a leap into modern small arms design. To complement the new rifle troops were issued the Model 1978 composite helmet, providing improved ballistic protection and a snug fit for long deployments. Standard field wear shifted fully to olive drab and khaki, a practical palette that worked equally well in the forests of Central Europe and the scrublands of Africa. This period emphasized modular gear. Soldiers now wore load-bearing vests that distributed weight more evenly than the old leather belts and webbing. Ripstop cotton blends replaced heavy wool, offering durability with lighter weight. Boots featured rubber soles and improved ankle support, while waterproof outer layers allowed troops to remain comfortable in rain or snow. Every element of the uniform was designed with mobility and endurance in mind, reflecting NATO's focus on rapid deployment during the Cold War. Elite forces and urban operations. The changing nature of conflict, marked by hijackings, hostage situations, and urban terrorism, led France to create highly specialized units. The most famous, the Groupe d'Intervention de la Gendarmerie Nationale GIGN, was formed in 1974 after a series of international crises. Its operators became a model for counter-terrorist teams worldwide. GIGN assault squads wore dark blue tactical uniforms reinforced with Kevlar panels and fitted with numerous pouches for ammunition breaching tools and communications gear. Helmets could be outfitted with face shields and night vision optics. Their body armor included both hard ballistic plates rated to stop rifle rounds and soft Kevlar layers for shrapnel protection. During ceremonial duties or public appearances, members often sported the dark blue beret of the National Gendarmerie, an understated but unmistakable badge of elite status. These uniforms reflected a new reality. Warfare was no longer confined to trenches or open fields. Urban environments demanded clothing that balanced ballistic protection with flexibility, allowing operators to move swiftly through tight corridors, board aircraft, or rappel down the side of buildings. Peacekeeping and global deployments. In the 1980s and 1990s, French forces served in peacekeeping missions from Lebanon to the Balkans and across Africa. For operations in Europe's woodlands and mountains, the Army introduced the Central Europe CE camouflage pattern, a 4-color woodland design, providing superior concealment in temperate zones. For desert or arid missions, a dune tan pattern soon followed. Kevlar helmets replaced older composites, while interchangeable body armor allowed soldiers to adjust protection levels depending on mission risk. Lightweight moisture-wicking undershirts and Gore-Tex rain gear offered comfort in climates ranging from Saharan heat to Balkan winters. The concept of the modular soldier able to adapt quickly to varied environments became central to French military planning. The FÉLIN system soldier as network node. Entering the 21st century, France launched one of its most ambitious modernization efforts, FÉLIN fantassin à équipements et liaisons. Integri or infantry soldier with integrated equipment and links. This program transformed each soldier into a high-tech combat platform. The Spectra helmet, lighter and stronger than previous models, came equipped with night vision goggles, integrated communication headsets, and rails for cameras or infrared sensors. Body armor incorporated ceramic plates capable of stopping high-velocity rounds while remaining comfortable during long patrols. The uniform itself featured flame-retardant fabrics and built-in wiring to connect to GPS systems and digital radios, allowing commanders to track units in real time. Soldiers carried a modified FAMAS rifle with optical and thermal sights, turning every infantryman into a sensor on the modern battlefield. Deployed during operations in Afghanistan, Mali and the wider Sahel region, FÉLIN demonstrated France's commitment to blending tradition with cutting-edge technology. The tricolor flag remained on the shoulder, but inside the fabric ran cables linking soldier to satellite, a symbol of how far the uniform had evolved. Ceremonial echoes of history. Even as field gear became increasingly futuristic, France preserved elements of its historic military pageantry. The Foreign Legion, famous for its grueling training and multinational ranks, continues to wear the white kepi, blue sash, and green epaulettes during parades, a direct link to 19th century Algeria. On Bastille Day, legionnaires marched down the Champs-Élysées with gleaming rifles and perfectly pressed ceremonial dress, reminding spectators of a lineage that stretches back nearly 2 centuries. At the prestigious Saint-Cyr Military Academy, officer cadets maintain an ornate dark blue uniform with red epaulets and a pale blue shako cap topped by a red and white plume. These brilliant colors recall the Napoleonic tradition and provide a striking contrast to the subdued camouflage worn in the field. The coexistence of ceremonial splendor and practical combat attire highlights the dual identity of the French soldier, guardian of both heritage and innovation. Operations in the Maghreb and the War on Terror. In the 2000s and 2010s, French forces conducted extensive operations in the Maghreb and across the Sahel to counter insurgencies and terrorist networks. Infantry deployed with the FÉLIN system and advanced Spectra helmets fitted with light amplification goggles. Their uniforms incorporated hard ballistic plates to resist rifle fire and soft Kevlar layers for shrapnel protection. Integrated hydration packs, lightweight backpacks, and advanced communications gear allowed troops to operate in the scorching heat of Mali or Niger for extended periods. These missions showcase the seamless integration of technology and tradition. The same army that once marched in red trousers now moved through desert terrain in muted camouflage, guided by satellite and night vision devices, yet still carrying the proud insignia of the French Republic. Legacy and continuity. From the late 20th century into the 21st, the French military uniform became a living chronicle of adaptation. Olive drab and CE camouflage signified NATO solidarity. The GIGN's dark blue tactical suits represented urban precision. The FÉLIN ensemble marked the soldier's entry into the digital age. Each stage preserved a thread of continuity with the past: the tricolor patch, the ceremonial white képi, the Saint-Cyr shako plume. The journey from the vivid scarlet trousers of the 1800s to the sensor-laden combat suits of today illustrates more than a change in fashion. It reflects France's ongoing effort to balance heritage and innovation, ensuring that its soldiers remain both heirs to a proud tradition and participants in the most advanced military systems of the modern world. As the 21st century matured, the French armed forces entered an era defined by rapid technological innovation and complex global missions. The story of their uniforms from the 2000s to the present is one of continuous refinement, melding cutting-edge protection and communications technology with centuries of martial tradition. The FÉLIN era in full. The FÉLIN system. Fantassin équipements et liaisons intégrées, or integrated infantryman equipment and communications, remain the centerpiece of modernization. Introduced in the late 2000s and continually updated, FÉLIN turned each soldier into a networked combat unit. The ensemble included Spectra helmet with integrated night vision goggles, infrared sensors, and a visor mount for cameras. Modular ballistic armor combining soft Kevlar layers and ceramic plates to resist both rifle fire and shrapnel. Digital communications gear woven into the vest and helmet, allowing commanders to track soldier movements in real time and share targeting data across the battlefield. Modified FAMAS or HK-416 rifles fitted with optical thermal and laser designating sights. Uniform fabrics were flame retardant and moisture wicking with built-in conduits for power and data cables. Soldiers could plug their rifles, radios, and helmet systems into a single battery pack. This made the modern French infantryman a node in a vast digital network, an idea that would have astonished the fusiliers of Louis XIV or the old guard of Napoleon. Operations across the globe. The first large-scale tests of FÉLIN came in Afghanistan during NATO operations after 2001. French troops patrolled harsh mountain valleys and dusty villages, their camouflage a subdued woodland pattern adapted for rocky terrain. Integrated night vision systems gave them a vital edge in twilight ambushes, while improved body armor helped withstand the dangers of improvised explosive devices. In the Sahel and Maghreb, beginning around 2013, French forces undertook Operation Serval in Mali and subsequent counterinsurgency missions across Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad. Here the army adapted again, issuing desert tan versions of FÉLIN garments and equipping helmets with cooling liners and extra hydration bladders. Patrols under scorching sun relied on satellite navigation and encrypted communications a world away from the paper maps and bugles of past campaigns. Evolution of the corps uniform. By the late 2010s, the Army began phasing out the venerable FAMAS rifle in favor of the Heckler & Koch HK-416F, compatible with NATO standards and easier to maintain in field conditions. Uniforms shifted from the Central Europe CE camouflage to the more versatile Center Europe. Desert CED pattern blending greens, browns and tans suitable for Europe, Africa, or the Middle East. Combat boots incorporated shock-absorbing soles and lightweight composites, while gloves used touch-sensitive fabrics so soldiers could operate tablets and digital sights without removing them. Special forces and paratroopers experimented with multicam patterns for maximum adaptability, while body armor moved toward modular plate carriers that allowed troops to shed or add protection depending on mission profile. Urban and counter-terror response. Domestically, the need for rapid counter-terror operations shaped the look of elite units such as the GIGN and Commandement des Opérations Spéciales (COAS). Their uniforms balanced ballistic protection with urban agility dark blue or charcoal combat suits reinforced with Kevlar lightweight helmets with integrated visors and compact carbines equipped with holographic sights. During high-visibility missions such as the 2015 response to attacks in Paris, these uniforms became a familiar sight to the French public, projecting reassurance and readiness. Ceremonial traditions hold fast. Despite all these advances, France has carefully preserved the visual heritage of its military. The Foreign Legion still parades in white kepis, blue sashes, and green epaulettes, the same colors worn in Algeria nearly 2 centuries ago. On Bastille Day, legionnaires march down the Champs-Élysées with the deliberate cadence and gleaming rifles that have become a national spectacle. The École Spéciale Militaire de Saint-Cyr, France's premier officer academy, likewise maintains its ornate ceremonial dress, dark blue coats, crimson epaulettes, and the unmistakable pale blue shako crowned by a red and white plume. These uniforms, untouched by modern camouflage, connect today's cadets to the grand pageantry of Napoleon's era. Republican guards on horseback continue to wear polished breastplates, plumed helmets, and crimson-lined cloaks when they escort the president during state occasions, offering a living tableau of history amid a city humming with modern life. Technology meets heritage. Today, a French soldier may stride into a desert patrol carrying a rifle linked to satellite data, wearing body armor rated to stop high-velocity rounds and communicating through encrypted digital networks. Yet on national holidays, that same soldier might stand at attention in a dress uniform whose design recalls the victories of Austerlitz or the defenses of Verdun. This dual identity, high-tech warrior and guardian of tradition, defines the modern French military ethos. The juxtaposition is striking: fiber optic cables alongside ceremonial plumes, night vision goggles paired with the centuries-old white kepi. In training grounds from Brittany to Djibouti, soldiers learn not only the latest tactical systems, but also the history that gives meaning to their service. Lessons of centuries. From the gray-white coats of the 1670s to today's networked FÉLIN ensemble, the evolution of the French military uniform mirrors the nation's broader journey. Each era's attire tells a story. Absolute monarchy uniforms as a symbol of royal authority and centralized power. Revolution and empire, bold blues and shakos expressing national fervor and Napoleonic ambition. Colonial expansion, lightweight, colorful garments adapted to deserts and jungles. Industrial warfare, the pragmatic horizon blue of World War I and the khaki of World War II. Digital age, integrated body armor and electronic systems that turn each soldier into a mobile sensor. Through it all, one theme persists. The uniform is never just clothing. It is identity, morale, and strategy woven into fabric and steel. Looking forward, France continues to innovate. Research labs explore exoskeleton prototypes, temperature-regulating fabrics, and next-generation helmets with augmented reality displays. Future soldiers may carry rifles integrated with drone controls or wear armor that adapts to ballistic threats in real time. Yet even these futuristic designs will likely bear the tricolor insignia and the echoes of centuries of French military heritage. From the Sun King's Fusiliers to the digital warriors of today, the French soldier's uniform has been both shield and statement. It has endured mud and monsoon, celebrated victories, and borne the weight of defeat. In every stitch, from brass buttons to fiber optic cables, lives the story of a nation that has repeatedly reimagined itself while honoring the legacy of those who marched before.